I finally got the script written. The next series, the next installment of the Bridge of Reason will be showing up soon. I've been going very slow, but it's coming.
Yeah. So is there one video up there?
Yeah, so I have 2 now in the Bridge of Reason series, and I'm working on the 3rd one.
Oh, that's really cool. Yeah. So yeah, everybody, as you can see, Josh and I are already in conversation, but we're live now. So Dr. Josh Rasmussen, thank you so much for being here, brother.
Thank you. It's a pleasure and an honor. And you can call me Josh.
Awesome. Yeah, so his YouTube channel, everybody, goes to subscribe. It's in the description. There's a link, Worldview Design. We were just talking his series he's working on. Yeah, I've been really enjoying your videos lately, especially the one you've done with the ones you did with your daughter. I found that this is really interesting that there's just to a child that so much of it is intuitive. What kind of inspired you to do those videos?
That was like one of my first videos, and she was just there wondering what I was doing, in the garage. And I was like, oh, sit here. And we just had a conversation, completely spontaneous. And it was just kind of blew me away just how she would have answers. Because one thing I noticed about my kids is if I ask them a question, they'll almost always come up with some answer. So the first one was, does God exist? She's like, yeah, well, how do you know that? So we had kind of a debate about that. It was pretty interesting.
Yeah.
So yeah, there was no sort of agenda or program. It was completely just spontaneous, just to see what she would say.
Yeah, I remember the first time one of my friend's kids asked me, well, like, if God made everything, who made God? And I was struggling because I knew how to answer the question, but I knew how to answer, people my same age. I didn't know how to say it in a way that she would get it. So I tried so hard, and she just wasn't getting it. And I was like, oh man, I really got to think, how would I explain this to a kid?
This came up actually, just if I could share this, when I was in graduate school, early in graduate school, substitute teaching. And one time I subbed for years. And during recess, 3 kids stayed to just talk with the sub. They just thought that was cool. I guess this is at the age where you think subs are cool and you could just like talk with them. So they asked me kind of who I was, and I told them I'm a philosopher. And so then I started asking them questions. I was like, so where did you come from? And some kids said, the dinosaurs, and then I was like, well, okay, where did the dinosaurs come from? And then somebody said, God. So that was interesting. And then I said, well, where did God come from? And all 3 kids were like, oh, that's a hard one. Like, I never thought about it. And so then we talked about it a little bit. And then I proposed this idea. I said, well, what if God is different? What if God doesn't come from anything? What if God's just always there? And when I proposed that, it was very interesting to see their expressions because they got very bright-eyed. And one kid just said, cool, we figured it out. And somebody else was like, can we tell the class when they come back in? Like we had just made this discovery. It's like they were too young to think, oh, this is the category of philosophy where you can't actually come to figure things out. It's all speculative. They're like too young to have that box. So for them, it was like, there was a puzzle. We got the answer. This made sense. They wanted to share with the rest of the class. So I thought that was interesting. Yeah. I told them, no, this is just our secret private conversation here. So we had a kind of a special conversation about that.
Yeah. Yeah, that's really cool. So I guess to the atheists out there who want to know, yes, Josh and I do engage in child abuse, teaching them about silly fairy tales.
Indoctrination, right?
Yes, indoctrination. As if, indoctrination wouldn't be the case for if you raise your kid as an atheist. Apparently that's, here's a question. I think Jonathan Pritchard brought this up. Are we indoctrinating the kids to teach them about arithmetic? Or like, yeah, they're young. They just take what you say for granted. But if we think it's true,
well, right, you know how this goes. If you're going to teach them something that's like your religion, that's rooted in psychology, not in understanding.
Right.
And there are different religions. And so, it makes sense that you would teach them your religion.
Mm-hmm.
I think, it gets difficult because it's almost like it's called indoctrination, sort of like if you don't think it can be known. But if you think it can be known, well, then it's like child abuse not to teach them. Right. So it all comes down, I think, to knowledge. Is this something you can actually know?
Yeah. Yeah. And that gets into stuff like the genetic fallacy when they say, well, if you were born in the East, you'd probably be a Muslim. And I just think that's not going anywhere. It just doesn't take into account the complexity of the human mind and how we come to learn things and how we change our mind and how we might leave religion, or maybe we might come back to it, or, Jesus appearing to Muslims in dreams and visions in the East world. I mean, this is a thing that happens. So, I just realized it's not in the frame, but this episode brought to you by How Reason Can Lead to God by Josh Rasmussen. It's still one of my favorite books. And I wrote a review
Mine
for the
too.
book for Free Thinking Ministry, so people can go there and see the book review.
Thank you.
Yeah,
Cool.
absolutely. So I was gonna ask. Oh, right. So I was gonna say, because we were kind of talking about beforehand, I'd shown you my new edition of Tactics by Greg Koukl, and we're talking about like, well, when somebody knows these tactics, you can use them for bad, just to steamroll somebody and just knock their arguments down, or you can use them for good to kind of just disarm them and help discover truth.
Yeah.
And one thing I was thinking is Steven Crowder, when he does the Change My Mind, he's so skillful at, especially if somebody comes in there and they're a little more like heated and ready to go, he's so good at making sure they feel heard, making sure they feel like they get their arguments out, and really friendly to disarm them. And I've noticed that's a skill that you have. When all the interactions I've seen you in with atheists, you're really good at that conversational skill about making them feel heard, taking their arguments seriously. And so I just wanted to ask you about that.
Yeah, well, I feel like it's essential to have a productive conversation. I mean, I sort of discovered this in graduate school when we'd be talking about different arguments, and there'd be certain conversational contexts where it seemed like the problem had nothing to do with the argument. The problem and the conversation had to do with sort of coming into rapport and actually wanting to be on the same side, trying to get to truth.
Yeah.
And when I saw this, I realized, okay, well, if I actually want to get more truth myself, if I want to increase my own understanding, and if I want to help others increase their understanding, then I got to remove the barriers to that. And there are psychological barriers. There are these things that get in the way. We're not just perfect reasoning machines. And so I think that there is something about helping people to feel like they're understood, helping them feel like they matter, their ideas matter. And then if that's done, then that lays the groundwork for truth to flow, ideas to flow, for everybody to increase their understanding of things. And I mean, you even mentioned the sort of genetic fallacy. And I think that when people are thinking along tracks that aren't correct, usually what's going on there is a couple things. First, there's probably something that's right in the neighborhood. So there's probably something that they are following. And so falsehood sort of is near the truth. But to find the thing that's right is really important. And I find, and I have to kind of tease you a little bit here, I find that even the use of fallacy can sort of cause a little bit of that polarization, because when people, there was a philosopher who gave a reply to an article, a chapter that I had written, and they said that one of my arguments was flawed. Okay. Now that bothered me a little bit because, first of all, the premise they said that had a flaw in it happened to be a true premise. It happened to follow from a principle of logic, and I think that we can show this to be true. But it was almost like by calling it a flaw or even saying something commits a fallacy, it's almost like what that does is it creates the contest, or it causes the almost like the desire to fight for one's own perspective, rather than that sort of curious state of seeking to understand, okay, like what is the best form of the reasoning? Like what's going there? When you're talking about how different people in different religions are coming to different views based on their religion, what is the truth in the neighborhood of that? Like what is the root of that problem? And I find that getting to the roots of the problem is kind of fun, like to see if I can do that. And then it changes the game, because then once we get to the root of the problem, we can look at it together and see, okay, is this something that we can analyze under a different light? Or is this something that I need to see? And I just to be very honest, there are things that I thought were kind of like bad reasoning, but then when I got closer to them, I saw good reasoning on the inside that I was kind of missing. And so this is one of the keys really to, I think, get to truth, is to have that kind of humble, curious attitude towards things.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, one thing I've learned from you to do in conversations is often like listening to the person and like you said, figuring out what's right about it. And so sometimes I'll tell them, I'll say, look, I think that's how you're looking at it is very helpful, but maybe we can take that principle and tease something else out, because I think there might be something you're missing. I tried doing that. Granted, I wasn't talking to Matt Dillahunty, but earlier when I was doing my review of Matt Dillahunty, I thought the reasoning principle he was using was a correct one. I was like, he's absolutely correct to be using this principle. But when you apply it, I just get a different conclusion than he does. So yeah, I think that's important. Here's a question I ask, and this will be perfect to lead into the argument from reason that we're going to talk about. I had a friend who I was talking to, and she was having a problem because I was saying philosophy is prior to science, in the sense that you have to have certain science is built on certain philosophical principles that you can't get anywhere else. And she seemed to think that, well, science is real. That's concrete. This is things we can know about the universe. This tells us the truth. And philosophy seems to be this kind of pie in the sky kind of thinking that you can philosophize your way into believing anything. And it doesn't actually really matter if I accept things like free will or laws of logic or whatever. It doesn't matter, because I can still do the science and get the same answers. So this will kind of get into this idea of tools for discovering truth. Why do you think it is people seem to limit themselves with their tools to discover truth and kind of just put most of their trust in science and think philosophy is just kind of pie in the sky thinking?
Yeah, I think people aren't aware of the other tools. This is one of the conversations I had with my wife, Rachel, while we were in graduate school, before we were married. And one of our conversations was about science and philosophy. She was the science PhD. I was the philosopher. And I kind of said the same thing, my field's prior to your field. And we were like talking about that. And she was like, well, no, I mean, we can do reasoning, like reasoning is part of science. And there was a specific example where you make some observations. So I think it's worth kind of sharing the example, because it shows, I think, how people can be unaware of other tools of thinking. So I had this example of there's a flower growing in a yard and you measure it. And on day 1, it's like 1 inch tall. And then on day 2, it's 2 inches tall. Day 3, you don't measure it because you went out of town. Day 4, you measure it, it's 4 inches tall. And day 5, it's 5 inches tall. Okay, so on day 3, how tall was it? Probably. Well, I remember my wife, she said, you can just observe from the data points that it's going to be a straight line. So you can observe that on day 3, even though you weren't there, that the best fit for that, for those observations, is going to be that it was 3 inches tall on day 3, because that would best fit the data points. But then I was asking her, as the philosopher, well, how do you know that that's the best fit? How do you know that? And she said, well, you just observe it. And I said, well, you don't observe that it's the best fit. What you observed were the measurements on each of the days that you were there, but how do you observe that it's the best fit? And so then we talked about simplicity and the simpler theory being having a higher probability. But this principle of probability, that the simpler theory, other things being equal, has a higher probability, that's I would say, a philosophical principle. You can label it however you want. It's a principle of reason. But the point is it's not something that you just observe. So I think what the scientists sometimes worry about is the philosophers are over here spinning webs of reason, and they're not tethering their beliefs to actual reality. Okay, we need to make observations. But the problem, though, and there's something right about that, okay, but the problem, though, is it's limiting. I like how you said that, it's limiting, because if all you have is your observations, you can't figure out which scientific theories even best fit the data. You can't even figure out that a true theory that is more likely to be true than that is false. And you might say, oh, well, by definition, a true theory is more likely to be true. Well, how do you know that? Right. How do you know that truth is truth? Well, that's a principle of A equals A. Now, how do you know? Like, these are very basic principles of reason. And I like to think of these as sort of bedrock to the foundation of science. Like, science gets off the ground by having logic and other principles of reason as built into the foundation. And so I think what happens is when people are kind of in the science world and they don't have these examples in the philosophy world, they are limited in their own analysis. They don't see that, oh, these principles of logic, that's part of philosophy. Logic is a branch of philosophy. Principles of reasoning, science itself, grows out of philosophical reflection. And even the scientific method, it's a principle of epistemology. And epistemology is a part of philosophy. So, so we had these conversations, my wife and I think that the lesson was we both expanded each other. What I discovered was that many of the things that I was calling philosophy, she thought were part of science. And many of the things that she was calling science, I said that those were part of philosophy. And so I think there is kind of this also verbal problem where people tend to extend the boundaries of their own field.
Mhm.
And so, like for me, everything's philosophy, right? In some sense, but I think it is helpful to understand that you do have more powers to know than just by observations. If all you had were
Mhm.
observations, you couldn't even know that you're even making observations, because how do you know that you're making observations? How do you know that?
Yeah.
Well, that's through this sort of introspective experience, and that's different than your five senses. And so yeah, you've got lots of powers to know, not just the five senses.
Mhm. Yeah, and if I'm correct, I mean, originally the word science, it meant knowledge.
Yeah.
So it would encompass, I think, all kinds of knowledge and tools to get knowledge. And I think, over time it just became more narrow field to kind of, doing it in the lab and things like that. And I think part of it too can be a confusion. If, like, let's say you have two people arguing about whether or not the universe is infinite or finite into the past.
Yeah.
They can be coming up with like going from anywhere from 3 premise arguments to 5 premise arguments to, doing all these things. And someone from the outside might be watching them and thinking, well, and not know what conclusion to draw, and hearing all these complex arguments and the Grim Reaper paradox and all these things, and think, well, wow, I could just philosophize my way into anything. And so philosophy is just kind of, it's wishy-washy and stuff like that. But I think what's taken for granted is that both people making their arguments, regardless of who's correct, are starting on this bedrock of reason, that we have to be rational in our arguments, that our arguments, for example, our premises can't contradict one another. Or if I can find a contradiction in your argument, it must be wrong. So there might be like broader philosophical things that are more wishy-washy, but all of that is built on a bedrock of stuff that I would say is sound knowledge that would undergird both more complex philosophy and science.
Yeah, I like how you put that. I mean, you have to distinguish between what's clear and what's less clear. So some parts of philosophy and logic, I think, are clearer. And then even the less clear things, they might be less clear to one person, but more clear to another, because it takes work to actually investigate those things. And I do think that there is something to be said about the problem of rationalizing things. I think the solution to that is humility. It's a call for humility. We just have to be willing to be wrong. We have to be careful to check and to test. And then also to be humble about the power of philosophy, because if you say dogmatically, philosophy can't give you knowledge, only science can. Well, how do you know that? Maybe there's a way of arguing for that, right? But then we got to look at that argument, and it's not going to be a purely scientific argument.
Yeah, I guess some people just have different knacks, and I guess just one of my knacks is I like to just be able to think about things and figure out what can I learn by just thinking, and can we just discover certain truths through tools of reason. So I think that's the perfect segue into the argument from reason. And so you were giving me a rough sketch of it beforehand, and so I will be able to bring it up right here and then have you give the audience the outline and a primer for it.
Yeah, and if I could just even add something as we come into the argument, and it's related to how to get to truth, and it'll relate exactly to this argument. I've noticed that people sometimes they limit their powers to get to truth because they don't recognize that they have powers from within, and they're kind of looking outward. They're looking to somebody else to think for them, and there's like external authorities that will tell them what to think. And because of that, they're not like exercising those inner powers. And I think a key to really get good at increasing your understanding of things is to really claim your powers, recognize your powers, and to make an effort to pursue truth. Let me just say something else about this, because I think what will happen is there's this sort of steering wheel that you have on the inside that you can control. It's the steering wheel of like where to look or how to focus or whether to be humble or to be dogmatic. Those are things you can control. But I think people disempower themselves when, instead of controlling the things that they can control, they will put outside of themselves all the powers to know things. You can't control what are going to discover. You can't control that. But you can control whether you're going to investigate what the scientists are saying, whether you're going to actually look at the data and get curious about, okay, does the abstract of the article match the data? I've seen many scientific articles, where the data had multiple different interpretations, and it didn't actually match the abstract of the article. Now, I'm not going to find that out if I'm not deciding to be curious. I'm not deciding to actually go deep. And that's a decision I have power over. I guess that's the point, is like, I have control over whether I'm actually going to investigate something or just let somebody else think for me. And that's so important for getting the truth. And so the way this then relates to the argument that you had on the screen, and you can put it back on if you want to, is that this is an argument for, this is an argument from reasoning itself for a fundamental mind. And so you have this power to reason inside of you, okay? And many atheists and truth seekers and people from all sorts of perspectives will say that it's important that we reason well. It's important that we are good reasoners. In fact, this is one of the objections sometimes to religion, is that religion is not about actually getting to the truth through good reasoning. It's about instead defending prior dogmas or whatever. And so we need to be rational. We need to be reasonable. Okay, so that's good. That's how we get to truth. But now, recognizing the value of reasoning can also lead us to an interesting argument for a fundamental mind. So here's the argument outline here on the screen. If there is no fundamental mind, then there is no reasoning. There is reasoning, therefore there is a fundamental mind. Now, it's a simple argument outline, and you might think of it as an argument category with different versions of this argument that you could fill in. And so we could just look at each premise, and I could motivate each premise. There's a fly. So do you have any questions at this point about the structure of the argument?
No, I don't think so. I think it's pretty straightforward. I just, not to go off too much rabbit trail, just when you said earlier, some people think of religion as not using good reasoning, and it just made me reflect to something Ravi Zacharias said, which is you don't have to choose between revelation or reasoning. You take the tools of reason and you apply them to the Bible to see if it's the revelation of God. And so you can use reasoning to discover that. And so I just really like that.
Yeah. Or if my wife tells me something, it's not like, oh, I have to shut off my head and shut off my mind, not even use reasoning in order for me to like believe what she tells me or something like that. So somebody can actually reveal something to you. Of course, the tricky thing comes in when there's a question about who to trust. But then that's exactly why reasoning comes in. Yeah. Figure out what's worth trusting. So so as far as the argument goes, it's a kind of simple argument. And I don't just expect somebody to just say, oh yeah, those premises are just obviously true. So we'd want to look at what would support the premises. But just to talk about the structure of the argument, it's nice to have an argument where if the premises are true, then the conclusion follows from the premises. Yeah. So it's a deductively valid argument. I believe this is modus tollens. So the form of the argument is A is premise 2. And then the first premise is if, if not, okay, let me just read we got the nots in there. So you have,
if not A, then not B.
Yeah, right? If A, then B, not B, therefore not A. So let me relabel these so it's clear. So you have, if A is there is no foundational mind, then B, there is no reasoning. Premise 2 is not B, which is the negation of there is no reasoning. So that means there is reasoning. So therefore not A. And then A is there is no foundational mind. So not there is no foundational mind means that there is a foundational mind. So you have a couple of negatives in there. So that's a valid argument for them. Yeah, okay. So now you might think, when you look at that argument, you might think, okay, the premise 2, there is reasoning, like that's the one that is obvious. We're not going to question that one. Like everybody accepts that one, right? It's the first premise that people would question. But it is interesting actually, because there are some philosophers who have questioned that second premise. There are some philosophers who've said there is no reasoning, there are no beliefs, there's no thoughts, there's nothing like that. I even met somebody in person who said there are no persons. Okay, so this happens. Actually, 2 different philosophers, not just one. Another one was giving a talk at Notre Dame, and he made the argument that there are no that he didn't exist, and so you might wonder, well, what motivates that? Well, there are different things, different reasons that might motivate that. But you might think that the first premise motivates that. Support that you need a foundational mind for there to be reasoning. Then this could be a reason to question that second premise. And one of the people that I talked with seemed to give this as the reasoning. They thought you couldn't get people from particles, minds purely from matter, and he thought that was impossible. But let me go ahead then and motivate the second premise, why I think there is reasoning. Okay, so I want to motivate that, and then we'll look at the first premise. Okay, so first, what do I mean by reasoning? I sort of think of two sides to reasoning. Okay, there's the one who's reasoning, the person who's thinking and trying to think rationally. And then there are the principles of correct reasoning or perfect reasoning themselves. You might think of these as principles of logic, like the law of non-contradiction, that nothing can be both true, and not true at the same time. The principles of logic hold firm, even if you're not thinking about them. Mm-hmm. So you don't have to be reasoning yourself for there to be reason, capital R, reason, where again, that's just designating all the true logical principles. Sometimes I like to say that the principles of reason are true every day of the week. They don't, if you're taking a logic exam, it's not like if it's Wednesday, then you have one set of answers, but if it's on Tuesday, then you've got to study a different set of answers. It's like, no, principles of logic are permanent, they're constant, eternal. Now this bug is just having a lot of fun over here. It's constantly attacking me.
It's okay. Yeah. If you don't mind, can I interject here? Because a guy like Dan Barker might say, well, no, reasoning, they're just human conventions, right? These are just products of a human mind. There's something, there's not laws of reason out there that we can touch. It's our minds just kind of apply them to things.
Yeah, I've heard people sometimes make the distinction between being descriptive versus, I guess, prescriptive. Right. So the idea is that, maybe our language just describes reality using logic, but it's not like logic is embedded in reality itself. So it's not really that there are these principles of reason. And my response to that is to say that actually it's fine, even if it is descriptive, we can still ask, what is it actually describing? So think, for example, about the following principle. If there are 4 people on a bus, then there are more than 3 people on a bus. Okay, now that principle is true. Now, in the correspondence theory of truth, to be true is to correspond with actual reality, to correspond with something, right? So now we can ask, well, what does this principle correspond to? I mean, if there are more than 4 people on the bus and there's more than 3, that's true. So it corresponds to something. Well, it doesn't correspond to, there might not even be any buses. It would still be true. Okay. And it's an if-then statement saying if there are 4, then there's more than 3. There might be no bus. There are buses, but let's just imagine that all the buses are destroyed. It's still true that if there are 4 people on a bus, then there's more than 3. So what's that describing exactly? You might say, well, it's describing our own minds, but wait a minute. Our own minds can think incorrectly. Yeah. I can have thoughts. I could have the thought, our own minds, like what does our even refer to at that point? Is it referring to your mind, my mind? Like whose minds? Imagine that we were all thinking that if there are 4 people on a bus, somehow we were thinking, well, in this case, it's hard to imagine us making such a mistake, but let's take something else. Let's take something like the Goldbach conjecture, where there's a mathematical conjecture. It's either true or not true. And we could all mistakenly think that it's not true, but we'd all be mistaken. Okay. If it is actually true, it's possible for everybody to happen to get it wrong, to make a mathematical mistake. So the question then is, well, what is it corresponding to if it is true? And it looks like it's corresponding to something that is, that exists for as long as it's true. Okay. Mm-hmm. And so if these are eternal truths, then this thing that it corresponds to is eternal. I think it's kind of an abstract entity or maybe even a conceptual something that is corresponding to. But it doesn't depend on the concepts in my mind or your mind, because the principles of logic remain true. They describe reality even when we're not thinking about them.
Yeah.
Does that kind of make sense? Yeah.
It does. So I'm thinking someone might be able to press the objection by saying, well, if there were no buses, there just wouldn't be true statements about buses. Or if there were no people, there just wouldn't be any true statements about people. And they might say, well, there could be a possible world with contradictions or where A doesn't equal A. It's just because reality is the way it is, we can't describe it another way. And so our descriptions are just what the reasoning is.
Yeah. So taking the first point, is it possible for there to be truths about buses, even if the buses are destroyed? Well, imagine the buses are destroyed and somebody says the buses were destroyed. Wouldn't that be true? Wouldn't that be about buses? I actually talk about this in my book on the correspondence theory of truth. I have a whole chapter on truths that correspond, truths about what doesn't exist, how they could actually correspond to something, how they could actually be true. Because, I mean, intuitively, there are all sorts of things that we say, like, oh, this no longer exists. Well, or there are no unicorns, Is that true? Well, what's it about then, if not unicorns? And so, it's difficult there to see. Now, there might be some way of translating that, but then the question is, if you translate that, can you maintain our sort of common sense talk about truths, about things that don't exist? And so there's a deep philosophy there, but I don't really think that it makes much sense to say that, if there are no buses, then it's not true that if there are 4 people on a bus, there's more than 3 people on the bus. It seems like that would still be true. In fact, this is why we can make inventions. Before they exist, we can come up with mathematical truths about how to invent something, how to bring it into existence. Using principles of mathematics. So, and then the other thing there about the possibility of there being contradictions, this gets tricky. We can get to the philosophy of math. It is one of the principles of logic that necessities are themselves necessary and impossibilities are themselves necessarily impossible. And so, if it's actually possible for there to be contradictions, then one of the principles of logic is that, well, then it's actually necessary that it is possible for there to be contradictions. And so then you have at least one thing that's necessary. And that's all we need really to get necessities, so. Yeah. So there's a lot there, but the idea here is that if you think of the laws of logic as whatever is necessary, then the question is there anything that's necessary? Like 1 = 1.
Yeah, I apologize. I didn't derail you too much, but I thought, as insofar as we were defending the second premise, people in their minds, I can usually see what objections people are going to bring to the table.
Yeah, those are important objections. Yeah, and I want to say that there's 2 sides of reasoning. So one is that there are these principles of reason, but then there's the other side, which is just us reasoning, us trying to have correct thoughts, and I think we can make the argument from either side. So, if somebody doesn't think there are principles of reason, well, are there at least people who reason? Are there at least people who are attempting to reason correctly? And maybe sometimes they actually do reason correctly. And so that would also be a dimension of reason.
Another thing, if I might add this, because it just occurred to me, even often, I've heard people say, well, it's just human reason. And sometimes they'll ask hypothetical questions like, well, back when there were dinosaurs, could we make the statement that 2 apples plus 2 apples, the apples equals 4 apples? And Dan Barker would actually say no, because there are no human minds. You can't make that truth statement that 2 apples plus 2 apples equals 4 apples. But one thing that just occurred to me was, well, even animals reason. I mean, people might say they're not capable of the kind of philosophical reasoning that we are, fine. But like if say a deer goes to a certain pond and drinks from it and then goes away and it remembers where the pond is the next day, well, that's a type of reasoning, right? It's using its mind to figure things out about the universe. It's trusting that the pond didn't just get up and walk away and go somewhere else. So I would say even then it has to be pertaining to an actual reality outside of just minds.
And that's a nice example because it illustrates that reasoning doesn't depend on our language. It's, our language is a way of representing our thoughts. If I have the thought that 2 + 2 = 1, I could represent that by writing it down with ink. Okay, but I could also write it down with chalk, and I could write it down in different languages. And I don't, some being that's not even human could also think the same thing without representing it at all. So you have to distinguish between the principle and its representations.
Even chimpanzees, for example, that's a good example because they can't count numerically one by one, but what they can do, for example, is if they're looking at another tribe of chimps and they want to figure out if they go to war with them or not, they can actually estimate based on the size if there's more chimps in the other group or less chimps. And if there's less chimps, they'll go to war. If there's more there, they won't. So even though they can't, represent the numbers 1, 2, and 3, there's still some principles of math going on there. So I'd say it's absolutely pertaining to actual reality, not just depend on minds.
Yeah. And so just to finish the argument for the existence of reasoning, I would say there are two powers that you have inside of you that you can use to see the two sides of reason. The one power you have is what I call introspection, which is the power to see, it's a kind of an inner light to see the thoughts, feelings that you're doing on the inside, such as sort of witness yourself reasoning. So that's introspection. And then the other power, I sometimes just call this the light of reason. It's the light by which you can see the principles of reason, such as that 2 + 2 = 4. And here, the light of reason, I think, reveals that these principles, though you see them within your mind, you also see that they don't depend on your mind, because you see that these principles have a necessity to them. 2 + 2 = 4. It can't not equal 4. It's equaling 4. It doesn't depend on whether you're thinking about it. And so you can see that this principle, you can see it within your mind, but you can also see that it transcends your mind. So those are your two powers, introspection and the light of reason, by which you see the two sides of reasoning. And so that is how I would justify that second premise, that there is reasoning.
Awesome. Yeah, no, I think that's great. And so I'll bring the argument back up here just to remind people as we go to the first premise. Here it is. Yeah, so now the first person, if there's no fundamental mind, then there's no reasoning. And so I'll let you get into that, and then I'll try to think of objections as you go.
Yeah, so there's kind of two ways you might think about this premise. So one way you might think about it is a kind of in principle, without a fundamental mind, reasoning could never arise. Okay, like just this could never happen. If you just imagine fundamental mindless particles smashing into each other, they could never in principle come to form rational thought or instantiate the principles of reason themselves, the laws of logic. That would just be impossible. Another way you can think about this is a kind of probabilistic principle, that if there is a fundamental mind, that successfully predicts the existence of reasoning, whereas without a fundamental mind, you don't get that same prediction, and so therefore the existence of reasoning is evidence for, supports the fundamental mind hypothesis. Now, I actually think both of those supports are pretty good. I would actually develop both of those. But maybe for our purposes here, it might help to focus on the more modest line, the probabilistic line first.
Yeah.
And we can come back to the other one if we have time for that. Any questions so far?
No, not so far. I'm working them up, but I'm going to wait for them.
Okay. Yeah, okay. So I think it's maybe helpful to see how a fundamental mind would account for reasoning. So, I think sometimes arguments can sort of create a dialectical pressure to sort of take a side, like either you're rooting for the argument or you're sort of rooting for its failure or looking for its flaws. And I think it's actually more helpful to not be in that frame, but instead to be in the frame of curiosity and to sort of see, okay, like, let's just think about this. Like, let's just unpack what would be the case if there's a fundamental mind. Like, how would reality be? What would you expect? All right. So a fundamental mind, as I'm thinking about it, is a mind that exists without depending on prior causes for its existence. It exists in a kind of robust way, and this kind of existence, I think, would be necessary existence. So it wouldn't sort of be able to fall apart or come into being, because I think those kinds of things depend on prior causes. And so this would be a fundamental thing that has mental capacity. Okay. Now let me just sort of fill out a theory of this fundamental mind. So let's just imagine that this fundamental mind, because it has this kind of necessary nature, it can't come into being or go out of being. Let's imagine this mind actually has necessary nature, the necessary principles of perfect thinking. So it actually has the laws of logic in the fabric of its nature. This would even account for how this fundamental mind is able to think itself, because it's able to think by following these bedrock principles of reasoning the law of non-contradiction, for example, these eternal principles. It's able to follow these. And this fundamental mind also has the power, because it is a mind, to do what minds do, such as to think intelligently and to intend a universe or other things that are not fundamental to unfold in intelligible ways, even leading to the existence of beings like us who can reason. So this is perhaps then not surprising that there would be beings like us who can reason. It's not surprising even that there are principles of logic. Now, some people say, oh, well, principles of logic just exist in all possible worlds, and that's that. But the fundamental mind hypothesis predicts that there are going to be these principles of logic that exist in all worlds. It gives you a deeper explanation, of how and why there are these principles. I mean, it is striking to me, I have to say, that at the fabric of the foundation of reality, there are these principles about how to think perfectly, how people should think perfectly. It's like why would reality care about how people should think perfectly? Like, why would there be these principles of perfect reasoning? That's just striking to me. But if there's this foundational mind, then we have this kind of predictive success. It predictively, it successfully predicts that there's going to be these principles of reason, these principles of logic, as well as the probabilistic resources to produce people who can reason. And then the question is, okay, would you get that same kind of predictive power on the negation of a foundational mind?
Right.
Well, now I think what happens at this point is somebody might bring in a theory that fills in the kinds of things we're looking for. So they might say, okay, maybe on naturalism, we can fill in that nature has these powers of a mind, but it isn't itself a mind. It just has the powers of a mind, and it can produce other minds. Okay, but the problem there is that when you come up with this kind of alternative theory and you build in the kinds of things we're trying to explain, then you've actually decreased its intrinsic or prior probability.
Yeah.
And so if you want to really have a competitor, I mean, the way that I think about it is, let's just start with, there is a fundamental mind, and then compare that with its negation. There is no fundamental mind.
Mm-hmm.
And then just ask, okay, well, what does the negation predict? And I can't see that from the negation you get really any predictive power, that there would be principles of logic or that there would be reasoning at all.
Yeah. Because even when we were discussing the alternatives before, the person who wants to say, well, it's just based on reality, like the world is just the way the world is, and rationality is just our language to describe it. Well, then you would have to say, well, in another possible world, the reality, the matter could be different. And so we'd have to use different kinds of reasoning to describe it. And so that wouldn't just say that reasoning is consistent across possible worlds.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. Yeah, so you wouldn't predict the consistency of reason on that hypothesis.
Right.
Exactly.
I think even further too. I forgot what I was going to say. I apologize. There's something about, oh right. So the person might bite the bullet and say, well, sure, reason could be different in different possible worlds, but we're confined to our world. So I'm only concerned about how reason applies to the world I'm in, because we're confined to it. We can't speak to other worlds.
Yeah.
And my response to that, I'd be interested in yours. Mine is, well, take something like, I think, therefore I am, right? In the world I'm in, that's just something I take for granted. That's a principle of reason that I can know I exist because I'm thinking. But if you imagine there's a possible world in which contradictions are true, in that possible world, it could be the case that I think, therefore I don't exist.
Yeah.
And so then, but if in both worlds I'm thinking, but both worlds I can connect, I think, therefore I exist, to I think, therefore I don't exist. Well, how do I know which world I'm in? I might be in a world where I don't exist. And so laws of logic would have to apply to all possible worlds.
Well, that's a clever argument. And you're pointing to the fact that it's one of the laws of logic, that the laws of logic are necessary. That's like one of the laws, so if you come up with possible worlds in which you don't have the laws of logic working in those worlds, then it begins to infect our world. Because then, like you said, how do you know they're working in our world? And I think the answer to that is that you can actually see in your own mind that the laws of logic exist and are necessary. Like, that's actually something that is very intuitive, that you can just sort of see. But I also sort of take the point, I've had long conversations with skeptics on this not skeptics of God, but just skeptics of logic, the
Right.
necessity of logic on this point. And I think the picture there is that, well, our very thinking is defined by the world that we're in, and we're sort of like trapped by that fact. But we can imagine a very different world where we just are programmed to think differently. And in that world, we would see that the laws of logic are different. And I don't want to say that, people are forced to agree with me on this, but I just think it's very intuitive that the laws like that, there can't be a square circle. It's not just that there aren't square circles, it's that there can't be square circles.
Yeah.
And that can't is itself a necessary can't. So the necessity of the can't, so so I guess what I want to say is my mind is programmed in this world to think that the laws of logic span the worlds.
Mm-hmm.
And so if that's how I'm programmed, you may say, well, how do you know your programming is reliable? Well, that's where I have those inner senses. I'm not assuming externally that my programming is reliable. I'm checking from within the principles of logic.
Mm-hmm.
If that makes sense.
No, absolutely, it does. And so maybe this thought I'm having will kind of spark further into defending this first premise. When I was younger, when I first got into apologetics, I did get stumped by this kind of dichotomy between, are the laws of logic descriptive or prescriptive?
Mm-hmm.
Because the atheists would argue, well, they're descriptive, right? So like they describe things. And I thought, well, that isn't right, because then things should be differently. And then I heard a lot of Christian apologists arguing that they're prescriptive, right? That God kind of builds the world on a plane of, say, the mathematical plane he has in mind, for example. So the laws are prescriptive in that way. But I wasn't entirely satisfied with that answer either, because it seemed to me, well, you can't have God creating the laws of logic. That doesn't seem right, or the laws of logic coming into being. And then my mind was changed when I read William Lane Craig's book, God Over All, because he kind of put it in a puzzle of like, well, if God had to create mathematics, then prior to God creating mathematics, how many gods were there? Well, you couldn't answer the question, but there has to be one God. Mm-hmm. And so the conclusion he came to, and I found this persuasive, which is that the laws of logic are descriptive, but they're not descriptive of this world. They're descriptive of fundamental reality.
Yeah.
And so because they're descriptive of fundamental reality, then any possible world that would spring forth because of fundamental reality would have those laws of logic built in kind of in a prescriptive way. And so I didn't know what you thought about that.
Yeah, no, I agree with that. And it's so interesting because the descriptive, prescriptive debate or distinction, it apparently shows up in the popular sphere. I'm not aware of it in the academic sphere. So when I started having conversations and this came up, I thought, oh, this is really odd. I mean, you don't avoid eternal truths just by saying they're descriptive, because it's just like what you said. Then what does it describe? Well, it's describing something that's eternal and fundamental. And especially if it's nothing that's physical, like if you say, if there were 4 ghosts, then there would be more than 3 ghosts. That's true. Okay, but what's that describing? It's not describing anything physical. So if you say that it's descriptive, it doesn't get you out of the need for there to be a kind of non-physical, transcendent apparatus, which I think is built into the fabric of the foundation. Mm-hmm. Which is why I think when atheists are thinking well, they are thinking along the lines within God's nature. They're actually witnessing from their own mind a part of God's mind, that these basic principles.
Yeah. One of the things you pointed out in the book when talking about how materialists try to explain the existence of a mind, and you talked about certain things like in neuroscience, we can see connections. And one of the things you pointed out was that, well, just seeing the connection or labeling the connection doesn't explain the connection. We're not just looking for the connection. We all agree there's a connection. The question is the nature of the connection. And so if someone's saying the laws of logic are descriptive, I would say, well, yeah, they describe everything. You're seeing the connection. But to me, that doesn't explain why the connection is there. Why can this table be described by logic? Why can everything in our experience be described by tools of reason? Well, because there must be something about the world itself that's reasonable.
Yeah, that's right. Like, for example, the table might have the property of, let's say, not being a square and circle at the same time. Okay, the table has that property. It's kind of a funny property.
Yeah.
Not being a square. And so, and in that sense, maybe you're describing the table, but that property that it has falls out of a more general principle that like nothing is a square and circle at the same time. And that's a general principle. And so if you write on a piece of paper that principle is describing something, but it's describing this more general, I almost want to say it's like a conceptual reality. It's like an abstract reality.
Yeah.
And this abstract reality, you might say, in some sense, invades every nature. Like every nature is consistent, so it invades every nature. That's kind of speaking loosely, but I mean, the point is that it is a reality. You know, it is actually real. It exists. It's being described. So, and it's not just physical.
Yeah, there's a very rich discussion there. Like my friend Tyler Vela, he's a divine conceptualist, so he would say that laws of logic, and that's what I used to say, that laws of logic do exist as concrete objects, and they exist in the mind of God. And of course, what I just laid out before is more of a non-realist thing to kind of say they're useful fictions. And by the way, that's not fiction in the made-up sense, right? That's fiction more in just they don't have ontological status sense. But I did think of this as a possible counter-argument. So I'm playing the atheist now as a counter-argument to the first premise. So let's say I grant something like determinism, that I say, okay, I believe there isn't a fundamental mind in reality. I believe in nature and atheism. And I believe in determinism because I think that the evolutionary process produced beings that didn't just, evolve free will, for example. So I believe in determinism. But through the deterministic process, we started to, because the organisms, even though they were determined, had to live in the environment. So kind of certain things I mentioned before, like the deer figures out where the pond is so it can go back to. That's just something that is programmed into it because it has to survive. And then as the creatures get more advanced, that kind of programming to figure things out about the world becomes more advanced. And so we can call that reasoning, even though we're just determined to survive in the world we live in. So how would you answer that argument?
Well, like you said, we can call that reasoning, but is that actual reasoning, right? I mean, I was kind of my son Micah, he's 11, and he was creating like an adder machine, and he had some devices that would he would send down I don't know, it was like a marble or something, and it would I had like 5 marbles plus 4 marbles, and he was setting it up so it add up to 9 based on how it came down. He was creating this machine, and so I was asking him if that machine was actually thinking, if it was actually coming up with that, and he was sure that it wasn't. And he was like, "No, it's not." Then if I was asking him, "Well, why not? What's the difference?" And we were having that conversation, and I think he just took it as intuitively obvious that acting or functioning to produce certain results isn't the same thing as actually thinking in the way that you and I would think from a first person perspective. We're actually considering numbers in your mind and adding them up. And so the reason I'm drawing this out here is that, you mentioned the kind of evolutionary history. The evolutionary history could explain how different machine-like things could function in certain ways for their survival, and even in ways that you could maybe call thinking. Have you ever said about your computer that it's thinking, it's got the hourglass, it's thinking? It's you could say that it's thinking, but it's not thinking in the same sort of first person sense that you and I would be thinking. And so that would be a different kind of reality that wouldn't yet be explained through this process. Did you want to add something to that?
Well, I was going to say I did sneakily build an assumption into the argument, which was because, there's the evolutionary argument against naturalism, right? If our beliefs are aimed at survival, not truth, how do we know they're true? And I built that in there in a sneaky way by just asserting that the deer had to learn where the pond was. So I was assuming, building in the premise that what would aid survival was a correspondence to reality, but that's not necessarily the case.
Right.
Something like a water source is obvious, but Brett Weinstein gives the example of, let's say you believe that porcupines can throw their quills. Well, it's not true, but it might be survivally beneficial if you think that because you stay far away from them. And certain truths like 2 + 2 = 4 might not correspond to reality, but they're just survivally beneficial.
Yeah. Yeah, I remember Plantinga gives examples where you have contents of beliefs that are sort of behaviorally indistinguishable from other contents. Like if you think 2 + 2 = 4, like, or I guess let's say, and the moon is made of cheese or something like this. And, or you just like add to all the contents like this thing, and then neurophysically, it could actually lead to the survival, but it could be false beliefs, and you wouldn't really be able to distinguish that in terms of the belief content that it's representing. And so, yeah, I mean, there's definitely a challenge there. And what I want to say is, like, even if you can overcome that challenge, you still haven't had any success in predicting that there would be first-person reasoning. All you get is sort of machine-like behaviors as if it's reasoning, which I don't think is the same thing. I mean, I think it's manifestly different. The sort of feeling that you're adding up numbers in your mind, that's different than Micah's machine just pushing marbles together. In fact, his machine only adds up numbers by interpretation. Like, we interpret that that's what it's doing, but it's not like really doing it like in and of itself.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a great point. That reminds me of I can't remember who was in the debate, but they said that minds have aboutness to them. And someone said, well, this book can be, the person responded, yeah, but it's only about the thing insofar as our minds kind of enforce that on the thing. Right? If it weren't for our minds, that ink in certain shapes wouldn't be about anything. Yeah, so I like that you're pointing that out.
Yeah, it's like we project our own powers out into other objects in the world. And like, we even talk about the laws of physics. It's like, oh, well, laws come from minds, as we understand laws, but we project that out there because that's just like how we think of things. But yeah, so aboutness itself, we say that, well, maybe there are things that are minds that can be about things, but only derivatively, only because we think of those words as representing something. And so the words are about something in virtue of our thoughts being about something.
Yeah. So let me bring the argument back up here. Is there any thing you'd like to add to either premise?
I think just in that first premise, I want to add something more about maybe the in-principle problem of how you can get reasoning from non-reasoning. I actually think this could become potentially very clear to somebody if you just really think about what your own reasoning is, and then you just imagine a pile of sand or something that's not intrinsically reasoning, and you imagine just throwing it into the air or trying to rearrange it so that it is intrinsically reasoning. And some things you just can't get from other things, and you can just sort of see that. It can just sort of click. Like, you can't just add up some numbers to produce people. You can just like see that in your mind. And I think that it's possible to just see in the same way that you can't get reasoning from non-reasoning, that there's just this direct insight that you can have there. And I don't claim that it's an easy insight. I think that examples can help orient your mind to the place where it just clicks. It's like, oh yeah, you can't get reasoning from non-reasoning. And once you get there, then you can just sort of see that, oh, that premise has to be true. And I actually think that this might be going on in the minds of some of the philosophers who are denying the second premise, saying that there is no reasoning. They're seeing that there is a kind of special problem of getting this kind of internal sense of adding up things or thinking through things, this real power on the inside of your mind, merely from these particles smashing into each other, or electrical signals or energy fields or whatever it is that's not intrinsically reasoning, that you can't go from the one to the other. And if that's right, then you have, if that seems true to you, then you have that as an additional reason for that first premise, in addition to the probabilistic or predictive success.
Yeah, I like that. So there's an atheist he's actually a mutual friend of ours, but anytime this argument comes up with him, I know he just immediately, if we're talking about like emergentism, right? So you might say reasoning is one aspect of a mind that on a naturalistic model may emerge from something like the brain. And what he always says is, he just says, well, that's just a composition of division fallacy. Like, no one brick is a wall, but you add up enough and you get a wall. And he'll use that kind of example a couple of times. So suppose he just throws that charge at you.
Yeah, well, my inference isn't from composition. It's not that I'm saying that, oh, well, the whole just has the properties of the parts. It's rather a kind of inference that I claim that one can sort of see to be true or find intuitive just on reflection, in the same way that one can see that adding up numbers won't produce a person.
Yeah.
I mean, there are some things you can just see can't come from other things. Like the cause has to, in some sense, connect with the effect in the right way. And I mean, I think of it sort of like, if you see, this is an example I've given, if you see water just springing out of a rock, you say, oh, the water is emerging from the rock. Well, okay, in some sense, the water is emerging from the rock, but you haven't explained how there could be water coming from that rock.
Yeah.
Probably the water is coming from within the rock, from another source of water, and it's coming through the rock somehow. It's probably not coming purely from a waterless source. And we understand this through experience, and I think reason itself, just our understanding of the natures of these things. And so I do think it's possible to just see that reasoning, and this takes work. I mean, you can't just get there by trusting somebody or by even just reading an argument. Like, you actually have to do the work yourself and pay attention to your own reasoning. You know, actually do some reasoning, and while you're doing it, like, focus on your reasoning and think about, what is that reasoning that I'm doing? And what am I, the one who's doing that reasoning? And then imagine something that's not reasoning. Imagining, take some sand, and then imagine that sand just somehow gets arranged in such a way that it's now producing that first person sense of reasoning. And I think that if you do that, you'll find it intuitive that that's just not the kind of thing that could be the reasoning from the non-reasoning. I have a co-author with Andrew Bailey where we rigorously argue for the inability for matter to deterministically make thoughts. This is called How to Build a Thought. And we use a different argument, and I won't get into the argument here, but I do want to just point out that there are other arguments for the impossibility there. So while I do think it's intuitive that you could just sort of see the impossibility, you can also argue for it in other ways.
Yeah.
So we do have another pathway there. And I also want to add here that I'm not claiming that you have to see it or that this has to be clear to any rational person. I think it's possible for somebody to not see the inference very reasonably. Maybe they're looking for another inference. Maybe they're looking for an inference to holes. That's just a fallacy of composition or something. And so they're trying to find it from another path, and they're not seeing it, and that's fine. But that doesn't mean that you can't see it, right? And so I claim that it seems very intuitive to me that it's in principle impossible to get mind from non-mind.
Yeah, I agree. I see that too, and I'd be interested in your thoughts on this, because I often get into these discussions with my friends. Sometimes they'll express certain concerns about artificial intelligence, and they'll say Elon Musk, and how we'll say, well, maybe eventually machines can think for themselves, or we'll build our computers so smart that they think, well, why do we need people around, or whatever the case may be. And my thinking is I don't see how something like freedom of the will or something could emerge in a machine that doesn't have any such power. And they'll point out to things like, well, machine learning. And I always say, but yeah, it only learns because the person programmed it and told it to learn. The person, you have to program in it to go on this website and take information. And if machines were to think, well, we don't need humans, my thought is a human had to program it to even question such a thing. But I'd be curious as to your thoughts on it.
Yeah, I have a similar thought. Andrew Bailey and I also have a paper on what we call the puppet argument. And it's a puppet puzzle. We present it as a puzzle. The puzzle is, how is it that agents can be responsible for their actions if they are just a puppet of particles pulling the strings? And we have this argument in there that the particles aren't you, because the particles can outlive you. Destroy yourself, even on a materialist frame. You destroy the brain and the particles still exist. But if the particles are pulling the strings on all of your behavior, then it seems like you're a complete puppet of the particles. And it's hard to see how you would be genuinely responsible for your behavior. And some people take that all the way out. They say, yeah, that's right. We're not responsible for our behavior. But I would argue the other way. You have this internal power to see your thoughts, your feelings, as well as to see your own responsibility for your behavior. You have a sense of that. And so I would argue that senses are evidence. Your senses are your evidence. They're your windows into reality. If you couldn't trust one of your senses, you couldn't realize either. All your senses are sense. And so you have this sense of responsibility, and that's evidence of your responsibility. But if you can't be responsible, if you're just a puppet of the particles, well, then that's evidence that you're not just a puppet of particles. You're not just built from the
Yeah.
bottom up, so to speak.
Mhm.
So there's got to be something else, some other way of accounting for how you, as an agent, as a self, as a person, can have causal influence over the material world without just being built up from the mindless motions of the material world.
Yeah. Braxton Hunter points that out. He says, listen, if we're determined, he's like, it's worse than a situation of no morality. He says you get moot morality, which is just, it's moot. Any moral questions about determined creatures are moot because it's like, it doesn't mean anything. But to your point about we intuitively recognize it, in the debate review I did earlier of Ray Comfort and Matt Dillahunty was saying, well, look, if God knew everything I was going to do ahead of time, I don't have free will. It's God's fault I sinned. God made me to choose to be an atheist, and God, original sin. And Ray Comfort just said to him, yeah, try that in a court of law. Tell the judge it's God's fault because that I raped this woman because original sin and it's just built into me and he knew it would happen. He's like, that's not going to stand. And I think the power of what Ray said is that there's just an internal knowledge of that's what our whole court system is based on, is personal responsibility and people being morally responsible for their actions. So I think it's really powerful the way you outline that.
Yeah. So there's a whole cluster of arguments, and you can sort of think of these as all arguments from your own existence. It's the arguments from person, the elements within you, your reasoning, your thinking, your moral sense, your free will, your moral responsibility, which I think is precisely why there is a certain kind of challenge on a mindless materialism to sort of account for those things, and why some mindless people who endorse a kind of mindless materialism would end up shaving off some of these things. Like, you don't actually have genuine freedom, or some even, you don't have real thoughts. Maybe you have sort of the behavior of thinking, but not the internal thoughts that they sort of seem to be in your own mind. You don't have that. You don't have responsibility. You don't have these different things because they are kind of hard to account for on a materialist frame. Now, I should say that there is a kind of reverse problem of understanding, well, if mind is fundamental, like, how do you get matter? Can mind produce matter? That seems, you might think, to be mysterious. But the more that I think about this, the more that I think that really, I think the problem is in our understanding of matter, that we sort of have projected a view of matter as fundamentally mindless because of a materialist frame. It's because of that materialist frame that we're thinking of matter as a kind of mindless substance, like rocks and trees are just fundamentally mindless. They exist in their own right as mindless substances, as material substances that aren't in any way based in mind. I'll unpack that in a moment. And so then, therefore, we're puzzled about how mind could produce something radically different from itself, this other mindless substance that can sort of exist in its own right. And the more that I think about it, just the more that I think that that's just actually a misguided understanding of matter itself, that matter is fundamentally informational. When the scientists are telling us the nature of matter, they're digging down to the fundamental, they say it's like fields, and then what are fields? And it's like, well, fields end up getting defined by equations. And then, like, equations are informational things in a mind. Information is in a mind, And so the more I think about that, like, the more that I think, I just think that when I look out and I see trees and clouds and stuff, it's like, well, really, I'm aware of my experience of trees and clouds, sort of pattern of experience, but that's a state of my mind. And then if I imagine, well, maybe there's something outside of my experience that sort of resembles those things. Okay, well, maybe it's the state of God's mind that's resembling the state of my mind. But the idea that there's something that's like fundamentally non-mental and material, I think that's actually the kind of spooky, mysterious thing. Like, why posit that? Why add complexity beyond necessity, in a sense? It's like, why not instead think that everything's fundamentally mental, forms in God's mind, or forms in my mind? So mind comes from mind. And now I would say matter is really understood in terms of some kind of state of mind, like an informational state or something like that. And then it doesn't seem like there's a problem that there would be matter coming from mind, because there's not a problem with information coming from mind.
Yeah. So would you be comfortable with a view like idealism? Because I just had Mike Jones on the show, and we actually discussed your chapter in this book, Foundation of Matter. And I read to him the portion where you talk about the imagination theory, that maybe the fundamental mind thinks on a public canvas. And he said, yeah, I agree with that as an idealist. And he liked that one very much.
I'm sympathetic with. I'm increasingly sympathetic with it. I sort of hesitate to use the word idealism because of its connotations.
Yeah.
Maybe I need to get over that. Actually, maybe I need to have a little more courage and just come out with it. Every week, I'm like more of an idealist than the week before. I think it's just the word itself is kind of a stickler for me. But
Yeah.
I'm comfortable with saying everything's fundamentally mental, or mind is primary to everything.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, I agree entirely, because I think by the end of that interview, I didn't really disagree with him on anything. I just think I still prefer the term dualist, because I would still like to make the distinction between the information that's fundamental to a mind and the information that's fundamental to matter. And he actually agreed with that distinction. He said he's a dual aspect idealist. But so, yeah, I'm happy with the view insofar as there is that distinction between the kinds of information and how they manifest themselves. But like you, I think I still prefer the term dualist.
Yeah. I like monism because it's simpler, but that's now just terms, like there's one basic substance. But yeah, I mean, there are, of course, different types. Like there's trees, there's planets. Those are different types. So how do you categorize the types? How do you categorize the categories? That gets a little tricky. But yeah, I like how you put that. I think there is a lot of synthesis here, and a lot of it is, I think, people coming to these questions with different sort of conceptual starting points, and then the more you sort of dig, you start to find, okay, here's a sort of the robust ontology that's coming into view, and it's one in which mind is primary. You can describe this in different ways, you can articulate it with different words, but to my mind, that just makes a lot of sense. It makes sense of how there can be principles of reason, how there can be the resources to produce reasoning beings, how there can be the resources to produce beings that have moral accountability, as we talked about. All of that makes sense. And as a kind of closing picture, if I could just have a picture, I sort of have this idea of like an airplane that's upside down, but you don't know that it's upside down. And I've heard that sometimes pilots have gotten their airplanes upside down and they didn't know it. And so they were trying to rectify the situation, but they ended up like crashing into the ground, thinking that they were pulling up, and they were actually pulling down into the ground. And it's like, well, when you're flying up and down, I mean, everything, so you interpret everything like that. And I sort of think of this sort of material first view as a kind of upside down airplane. It's like, it makes sense. You think it's right side up. You think the material comes first and then minds emerge. Like you think everything's explained in terms that matter. But I just think that that's fundamentally the upside down view of the world. And that if you can just turn that around, even if you're not sure, just sort of play with it, sort of imagine it in your mind. If you're watching this and you're kind of accustomed to thinking of matter first, just for fun, just play with it. Just imagine mind comes first and see if you can reinterpret everything. It's sort of like the young woman, old woman face. It's like, see if you can sort of reinterpret all the lines of reality in terms of mind coming first. And I think that you'll be intrigued by how much actually makes a lot of sense. Like things start falling into place. It's like, oh, okay, principles of logic, those are built in the fabric of the foundational mind. That makes sense. These are perfect principles of thinking. This makes sense of why even there's a universe that's finally tuned for intelligent beings. Like, because it would have the intelligence, it would have the resources to intend a universe like this. So you just go through even the laws of physics. The laws of physics are laws. They reflect thoughts in the mind of the foundation. And so like all of those things start making more sense instead of just saying, oh, they're just there. They're just brute. They have no explanation, or they're explained by something that's ultimately mindless. This helps you to make the whole world, I think, more intelligible.
Yeah, I agree. So I'm going to put this back up here, and guess as we close, I do want to kind of ask, well, first I want to say one of the things I really like about this argument is because our mutual friend who's an atheist likes to take a lot of the arguments for God and say, well, you can just take the necessity and subtract the consciousness, or it can be some kind of naturalistic foundation that has enough power to create the universe, but it doesn't need consciousness. And this argument leads deductively to a consciousness. And so I guess in closing on it, I wanted to ask you is, so once we deduce there's a fundamental mind, what more implications can we draw out from that?
Yeah, so I mean, I think that because it's fundamental, then it's not going to have any kind of contingencies that call for further explanation. And I think that if it had sort of arbitrary limits, we've talked about this kind of argument from arbitrary limits, then those arbitrary limits would be contingent and would call for further explanation. So I actually would think that this foundational mind would not be arbitrarily limited. So it would be foundational, but also you shave off the arbitrary limits. It would be a supreme mind. And this also would explain how it could have the supreme principles of reasoning sort of built into its nature somehow. Or I know you were referring to another model. And so there are different models, and I don't want to suggest there's only one here. But I do think that you can tease out some additional implications once you start thinking about how this mind could be fundamental. How could there be a fundamental mind that has no further cause? Well, if it had arbitrary boundaries and limitations, seems like those would have a further cause.
Yeah.
And so if it's fundamental, I think it's got to be a supreme and unlimited mind, for example.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. No, I absolutely agree. So to the audience, I want to let you know, I highly recommend everyone go out and get this book. You can get it from Amazon. That's where I got it. I would assume many other places where you buy books. And if you want to see these ideas outlined more, they're outlined very well in the book. Josh, your YouTube channel is Worldview Design. Are there any other places where people can find you?
Joshua L. Rasmussen is where I have my resources, and I've uploaded now all my publications. My peer-reviewed articles are up there, and I have some recent stuff on the argument from contingency that's coming out, and I have links to that there. So you can get all those resources are free, and they're there to just serve the explorer. And I want to say this because I've noticed in different cultures or maybe different goals, different emphases, and I just want to say that one of my heartbeats is to serve the explorer and to say it's good to explore. And I don't really even want to trap you into believing something by an argument. I'd really rather the argument empower you. In fact, that's why the title of the book there is How Reason Can Lead to God. It's liberty there. There's a freedom to explore that and to see the path for yourself. And so I want to really, this is something that I really care about, that all these arguments that we look at, they're all just there to aid people who are wanting to fill out their understanding. You really genuinely want a greater understanding. And you may not agree with me at every point, and that's fine. That is fine. So I always like to say, like, take what serves you and just like put to the side what doesn't serve you, because that's all I really want to do. Is I want to give you something that will really serve you and encourage you on your journey.
Yeah. So actually, last thing, somebody did put in a question at the last second. I thought it was a good one. It says, if someone could account for the emergence problem in property dualism, would that be a defeater to your argument about gaining rationality in terms of origin?
I cannot think I because there are different parts of the argument here. So,
oh, your voice went out for a second. Now I just hear the buzzing. All of a sudden, that came in dominant.
Am I buzzing now?
Yeah.
I'm sorry, guys. This question is a great question. I think it might be defeats on the arguments but I don't think it would defeat the argument of success.
Yeah, so unfortunately, I can't hear anything you're saying. So I think unfortunately we'll have to. I feel bad because I put up the question. Oh, wait a minute. Oh.
I'm trying to move my devices to see if
I can
in
hear
the
you
last minute we can get some final audio here.
Yeah, I got you back.
Yeah. So I think it's going to depend on the account. So I think sometimes what people will do when they give an account is they will give a kind of maybe empirical story about how one thing is connected to another. But this could be like if I turn on a lamp and let's say I flip a switch and then the light from the lamp glows, and we can give a empirical story about how that works. There's a connection there. And that helps, because in that case, there isn't really even an in-principle problem necessarily between the flip of the switch and the light. But there's still this like deeper question about like, okay, how can there be even a law of physics? How can there be that? And so like, even if you have an account of the emergence, you still have a kind of law, an emergence law. And in my view, laws themselves are based in thoughts. So I don't even think you could have an emergence law unless there was already a mind to give rise to the law itself, if that makes sense.
No, absolutely.
Yeah, so I think there's just actually a lot of things here, and I think that it's almost like there are many paths to truth, and there can be ways of sort of blocking off one path, but it still leaves open others, or some original paths will come back in another form. So it's a really great question. I do think that there are emergentist theories that can block off certain arguments, but I do think that there are still other arguments. And when I was cut off, I was mentioning even just the argument from predictive success. If you have a foundational mind, that's going to give you a probabilistic resource for producing reasoning beings, for even producing the very ingredients for emergence to occur, if that makes sense.
Right.
For setting up the emergence framework.
Yeah.
And so you still have evidence that way.
Yeah. No, I really like that because, yeah, even if God uses evolution to produce beings with reason, there's going to be a mechanism in there that was designed by the mind. So I think that's an absolutely brilliant answer. So, Josh, this was an absolutely great episode. I really do appreciate you taking the time. And again, the YouTube channel, Worldview Design, the book, How Reason Can Lead to God. Dr. Josh Rasmussen, thank you so much for being here, brother, and we'll do it again soon.
This was so much fun. I appreciate it. Thank you.
Absolutely.